Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and today I was delighted to be joined by Jack Pitt-Brooke and Charlie Eccleshare, both from The Athletic. Jack and Charlie joined me to talk about Tottenham. Of course, we did record an episode not too long ago on Tottenham, but in the time since, lots has changed. So there's a lot more to discuss now, not least Jose Mourinho and 3 games played so far under him. This episode of the podcast is supported by The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. Get a 30-day free trial and 50% off an annual subscription by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. And thank you very much for downloading. Jack, thanks for coming back, man. We weren't expecting to have you back so soon, but events have occurred and your presence is necessary. Also, welcome to Charlie Eccleshare, your first time here. Thank you so much for coming.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Can we start with you guys, whoever wants to go, I don't mind, just walking us through what happened with the relationship with Pochettino? Because I've read some stuff about how maybe that could have ended in the summer or was expected to if results had gone better in the Champions League final. What happened and how far back are we going?
I think we have to go back into last season, certainly. There's no getting past the fact that Pochettino is a very demanding manager. The style of football he wants to play is very difficult and it requires the players to be incredibly fit, to do endless training sessions, double sessions, not many days off, to make themselves physically ready to play his style. He's also very, he's quite controlling in terms of what he wants his players to do and say, and inevitably players will get tired of this. I mean, this is something we see in football a lot. Even the very, very best managers in the world, and I think Pochettino is in that bracket, they can only get through to their players for 3, 4, 5 years. I think we see this with Pep Guardiola, Antonio Conte, Jurgen Klopp at the end at Dortmund, and I think we can now say with the benefit of hindsight that is what happened to Pochettino. The players basically got tired. And even though Spurs did fantastically well getting to the Champions League final last year, if you look at their Premier League form, they were rubbish after Christmas, basically. They barely played well at all. They were scraping over the line. And were it not for the fact that Chelsea, Arsenal and Manchester United had all struggled, Spurs probably wouldn't have finished in the top 4. So I think Spurs had been on a gradual decline from maybe about January 2019, I think the first time I saw them and thought, wow, they don't really look like Spurs anymore, was when they lost the League Cup semi-final to Chelsea at the start of this calendar year. And that decline continued over the course of this summer. There had not been enough signings in the previous summer, that is 2018, to refresh the squad in such a way that Pochettino could get more energy out of the players. The business that they did this summer, signing Sessegnon, Lo Celso and Ndombele, was, I think, ultimately too little too late. And this meant that there was no way to fix this kind of lack of this depletion of energy in the squad. And I think from speaking to sources connected to the Spurs squad, the overall feeling was, we've given this guy everything. We've worked so hard for him over the years and we've got nothing left to give. And that, I think, is why results were so consistently bad over the first half of this season. And ultimately, Daniel Levy realised that once that's happened, you can't fix it. You can't recreate the conditions that you had at the start of the Pochettino era that made him so successful. And that's why, unfortunately, the only solution he had was to replace the manager.
Yeah, I mean, unless you think, because there was this debate as to, I think everyone accepted that it was broken, and then it's to either get rid of the manager or do you get rid of the players? But obviously to get rid of the players requires so much time and money. So it was a far more simple and sensible solution to get rid of Pochettino, despite the fact that for a lot of fans that seemed incredibly harsh, given all that he'd done for the club over the previous 5.5 years.
So we talk about the idea that, as you said, connected to sources within the club who are saying that we're all tired and we've given our all to Pochettino. Reading those reports at the time as they were released, many of them on The Athletic, there were 2 different ways of looking at it. One was that there was a little bit more of a toxic relationship there at the time. Players were maybe being frustrated at the lack of results, as I suppose the manager would have been as well, and the very prolonged period in which they had to work extra hard or whatever that is. The other way of looking at it is that it's kind of a more amicable divorce in a way, as you put it, that it's a lot easier to replace the manager than it is to replace the squad. That it, had been five and a half years, and the players had nothing left to give. There was no other alternative. Where does the barometer fit between those two separate ideas?
I don't think it was quite as toxic as, for example, Mourinho 2015-16 at Chelsea, which was very, very toxic, and there was this kind of constant battle going on, I think, between Mourinho and his squad. We never really saw Pochettino turn on his players that much in public. I think that's telling. Lots of the players came out after Pochettino was sacked and stated how grateful they were to him. I had conversations with players after the West Ham game, Mourinho's first game, where they said the same thing. So I don't think there's an animosity. I think it's more just, maybe toxic is the wrong word. I think it's more just a sense of exhaustion and staleness was the issue.
Exhaustion by what though? By the relationship, or by the? I mean, are we to believe that training under Pochettino is physically much more demanding than it is under most other coaches?
I think there is an element of that. Yeah, I think the word I would use is almost resignation. It was just like, we want to keep working with this guy, but it's hard now. I think you look in any job, and if you're in the same place for too long, it can just feel a bit stale, and you need a change. You need to hear new voices. Being told the same thing by the same person can just get a bit wearing over time.
So it's psychological.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of it. And I think Jack's right that there wasn't the kind of turning on the players like there was at Mourinho's Chelsea. I think the only time that really happened was after the Colchester game. Do you remember when there was a little bit of a suggestion that players, weren't doing quite what was expected of them. And I think, there is a fragility there, and players don't really like being sort of questioned in that way. I think also another element that's important to talk about is the fact that a lot of them didn't feel they'd had the sort of the sort of pay rises that they might have done a few years earlier. So, in 2017 they finished second with 86 points, and I think a lot of them thought they might, start earning a bit more then. That didn't really happen, and so you've got that when you're, working your ass off for someone, and they are obviously well paid at grand scheme of things, but you're looking at players at other teams and maybe you're not getting paid so much. I think all of those things combined, and then the letdown of not winning the Champions League. So I think they all combined in this sort of big letdown at the start of this season, and then results didn't go their way, and it's just like, we're sort of done with this now.
I think that's a really important point about salaries and contracts. Like, the whole Pochettino method is very dependent on players who are desperate to prove themselves and are hungry and ambitious, and are happy to kind of go the extra mile, even though they are not getting rewarded for it in the meantime. And so it fitted perfectly into the Tottenham wage structure, in which most of the players are underpaid by market standards, and yet Pochettino put together a squad of players who would try extra hard for him because they believed that he was the man to take them to the next level. Now, the problem is that can only last for so long. Like, you've only got a few. If you're going to operate in that way, you've only got quite a small window of 2 or 3 years in which players will do all that work, and then eventually they'll just get a bit miserable because they haven't got their money. And Pochettino knew this, and he wanted to sell players so he could refresh the squad. But because he didn't do this, it actually had the effect of making the atmosphere even worse, in the sense that lots of these guys knew that Pochettino wanted to sell them. They wanted to go. They hadn't been sold. And then they had to come back for the start of this season or the start of the previous season, knowing that Pochettino didn't even want them there anymore. And so basically the amazing balancing act that was finishing that high with that little wage spend inevitably collapsed, as it always was going to.
Who are we talking about? Players that either knew that Pochettino maybe wanted to sell them, or players that wanted to leave? Are there specific names?
Well, at various points, Eriksson, Alderweireld, Wanyama, Sissoko, Aurier,
Danny Rose.
Yeah, they've tried to sell, Rose nearly went in the summer of 2017. Then Spurs tried to sell him in 2018 and couldn't, and tried to sell him in 2019 and couldn't.
And they can't because there are no takers, or they can't agree terms, or...
A combination of... I mean, he nearly went to Chelsea for 55 million at the end of the summer 2017 window. And since then, it's been difficult to find a team who would, offer a good pay rise and could do a deal with Daniel Levy. I mean, Levy's an amazing negotiator when he's got a player that another team wants. Like, that's how you get 100 million euros for Bale or 55 million pounds for Kyle Walker. But what's much harder is being in a situation where you've got a bunch of players who you don't especially want, and then you're ringing around other clubs saying, can I sell you Aurier, Wanyama, Sissoko, or whoever else? Like, it's in that sense.
I won't let them go for any less than what you don't want to pay.
Yeah, like the power dynamic is switched, and it's hard to sell the players.
And I mean, Eriksen's another one like that. Apparently, he was quoting huge money this summer for a player that has a year left on his contract, and everyone's just like, "Well, we're not going to do that.
Just wait."
Yeah, well, we're just going to wait. And he's done. I think he's priced out a lot of players from the market. And like, yes, his great skill is, as Jack says, he will. When a player's in demand, he will get the absolute maximum and he will never be taken advantage of. But there is a problem sometimes because he just makes it very difficult to sell players. And Pochettino knew as well as anyone that squad needed a shake-up, but he wasn't really allowed to do it. To do that shake-up, you need to get rid of players first.
Yeah,
and that just didn't happen.
Yeah. If you want to look at like a concrete example of how this could work, look at Atletico Madrid. So Atletico Madrid are not... Their football is not exactly the same as Pochettino's football, but they have a similarly like intense, demanding Argentinian manager. And obviously Simeone's been in that job since 2011, so he's been there for 8 years, and he's managed to avoid this kind of classic 4-5 year problem. And the reason is they've had an incredible turnover of players. Like the team now is very different from like the team that lost the Champions League final in 2014. And because they've always been able to get rid of the older guys, get new players in who are hungry enough to give you that kind of like intense freshness that kind of management demands, that means they have managed to avoid that kind of trap. Now, I think that looking back, that's the only way that the Pochettino era might have lasted for longer than it did, would have been with a serious turnover of players back in 2017, 2018, to mean that nowadays they would still have that same sort of freshness, which obviously they don't have.
Do you think in a way it was difficult for Spurs because the squad that they had and the context of the seasons in which they were playing meant that they were never... I mean, retrospectively, they always seemed quite far from challenging for the title, but at the time, they were always there or thereabouts. They were never too far away from it. Do you think that there was a worry that maybe Daniel Levy had, or maybe not so much Pochettino, but other figures at the club, a worry that if they did engage in a kind of high-profile turnover of players, that they might drop off the pace a little bit when they were so close to achieving something?
Oh, what you mean? It wasn't time to go into a period of transition?
Yeah, or just that one more year with this group of players might be the one that gets you over the line. Yeah,
potentially. The hard thing with that is that it's very difficult to kind of make that turnover of players to do that quickly. It does need to be a kind of gradual process. So I think now in retrospect, ideally, yes, maybe not shed, 4 or 5 important players in one summer, but maybe you let 1 or 2 go and then, you build it gradually. Might have been a more effective way of doing it, whilst at the same time bringing people in. Whereas, they had that crazy 18-month period where they didn't sign a single player. That is utterly mad for a team with their ambitions.
And I suppose because of the character and the persona of Daniel Levy and the way that he's talked about by supporters and the football media, for example, that was, whilst it was a bizarre occurrence, it was also by some considered to be a mark of how good Daniel Levy was at his job, that they maybe didn't need to buy players for 18 months, or that he was willing to hold on out for the right deals. Do you think Tottenham are kind of trapped by his character or his perception in that way a little bit as well?
Maybe. I certainly think that the way that he operates in comparison to his rivals, who are much more willing to spend money freely, means that he needs a very, very good manager. And he got lucky with Pochettino because he got a manager who was perfect for the way that he wants to run the club. And even though things obviously went sour this year, the Pochettino era has still been an absolute triumph for Tottenham by any measure. Not least because it's now gotten to a point where they can appoint Jose Mourinho. But yeah, I certainly agree that the way that Levy operates did make it harder for Pochettino, certainly, to sustain that success into a sort of 4th, 5th, 6th season.
Because the stadium build was going on at the same time as well, so you've got all that to consider. So you're thinking, long term, that's brilliant for the health of the club, but it's frustrating for Pochettino at a time where they were so close, and having finished with 86 points in that 2017 season and finished second, to then not be that... I don't think they lost in that final season at White Hart Lane.
No.
So then all of a sudden you're taken away from this fortress that you've built up, and you're playing at Wembley, which is pretty soulless venue, especially for club games. So that's another thing he had to deal with. But I think as well, just to, look back on the player element, I think I read today, in our piece on The Athletic that Eriksen's on 80 grand a week.
Yeah.
I mean, I not to sound all Ashley Cole, but I almost swerved my car off the road, figuratively speaking. I couldn't quite believe that, for someone of his ability. And you think it's no surprise then that he wants a big payday before he... I mean, obviously these are astronomical amounts of money in the real world, but relative, that's...
If you're going to earn double, you would have thought minimum double at your next job. I mean, I'd leave Tifo tomorrow. I wouldn't really. Don't worry. I suppose we've lingered on Pochettino long enough. I'm sort of aware that maybe people won't want to be too retrospective. But can we discuss the week, or I guess what was it really? It was a 24-hour turnaround from the announcement that he had gone to the announcement that Jose Mourinho had arrived. Do we know how long in advance those talks with Mourinho were taking place? Presumably he'd made his interest aware to the club.
Yeah, they must have had... Yeah, clearly they had Mourinho in the bag by the time they sacked Pochettino, or they wouldn't have sacked Pochettino when they did. I think there'd been crisis talks between Levy and Pochettino dating back to the start of the previous week. That is just after the Sheffield United game.
Right.
At which... the future of Spurs was clearly up for grabs in these talks, and his future was on the table. And it was still a bit of a surprise when they actually sacked him, or when he was relieved of his duties, as the statement put it. But they would only have done that once they had Mourinho ready to roll out the next morning.
Right. Yeah. And in terms of Mourinho as an appointment, it's Mourinho, so it's always going to generate a lot of interest and a lot of news. But it did seem to me and many people to be quite surprising, given the stark differences that we associate with the way that both of those managers like their teams to play football. Did it seem like that to you?
Yeah, that, and also just the type of manager that they are. Pochettino was this project manager who built Tottenham up over, in relative terms, modern football, a longer period of time. Whereas Mourinho, we know, is a kind of... he'll come in, shock therapy for 2 or 3 years. 3 years is probably the maximum you're really going to get for him. So even that element as well.
Which is something I was going to ask you, because given what we've just discussed about the team and the player turnover that is maybe required and the tired legs and all the rest of it, you would have thought that they would have been on the lookout for another project manager, because Tottenham clearly need a rebuild. This seems to me to be the wrong time to appoint Jose Mourinho. What do I know? They've won every game so far, but what do you think?
Yeah, maybe. Although I also think Pochettino left this really good squad of players, and I don't think it needed much. They're such a talented group. They know each other already well. It did almost just need a change and someone to come in and remind them that they are very good.
So it just needed those things when Pochettino was the coach, maybe. And if you remove that element, it's not so necessary anymore.
Potentially. I mean, and I think Mourinho is... It's a bit of a cliche, but he has won. He's a winner. He's won so much stuff, and that is the one thing that Pochettino didn't do. Admittedly, it's a big thing, but and it's the one thing those players, none of them really have much silverware to their name. So I think just having someone who can come in and give them that belief that they can get over the line could potentially, it could be quite a good combination.
Do we know much about the reception of Mourinho from the players? I mean, I read that some of the players weren't aware that Pochettino was going to be relieved of his duties when he was, until after they'd seen the announcement. Do we know whether some of the players had been asked about Mourinho beforehand? Harry Kane, for example?
Yeah, so there's a report which we didn't write saying that Kane had been consulted in advance. I do think the players have been very receptive to Mourinho coming in for the reasons that Charlie just said. These are guys who've worked very hard for a long time for Pochettino, and in trophies terms have nothing to show for it. But now they've got a manager in who can promise them, who can show them that he's won an awful lot everywhere else he's been, with the exception of Manchester United.
And even there, he won 2 trophies.
Yeah. And I think the players will believe in him. I think they've been impressed so far with his energy and his kind of tactical tweaks and the atmosphere that he has changed the atmosphere simply by being himself around the training ground. And I do think the players are going to buy into it.
I wonder as well. I mean, I agree. That's everything I've heard as well. Is that they have been very responsive and the atmosphere has been very good as well. And I wonder if they. He's a bit of a caricature in the media, isn't he? I wonder actually within football circles, whether there's a slightly different perception of him to the one that we have as this kind of pantomime villain. I suspect, amongst elite level footballers, it's a slightly more nuanced view of him.
What are they looking for? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose so. That's an interesting way of thinking about it, isn't it? I mean, how engaged are they with the news cycle, for example? How much of that pantomime aspect of it do they actually see?
Yeah, I just expect they'll have they'll all have friends who've worked with him at Chelsea or United, and they'll hear all the good elements of him as well that, perhaps aren't as on the surface, because he is this kind of agent provocateur. That's what we see, but
well, also
there's a lot
it's
more
a
to
sort
it
of,
than that.
Yeah, and it's a kind of ultra competitive sporting environment, right? I mean, they're all just desperate to win, presumably. So I would imagine that they see Mourinho, like you say, as a winner who might help them win.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned Mourinho being himself around the ground. I wanted to pick up on something we talked about briefly beforehand. I listened to your podcast for The Athletic about Tottenham earlier on, where you talk about this as well. So maybe we can just touch on the idea that Mourinho is talking about himself as being quite. Is it the word he's using? Humble? Is that the one?
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
Which is at odds with what we know about Jose Mourinho. Do you think this is a sort of genuine thing, or is this? He keeps saying it's not about me. It's not about me. Clearly, it is. Maybe not the. The question here is whether or not he desires that, or whether he's deliberately attempting to come out with that result. But what's the whole humble thing? What's happening with the humble thing?
And the thing you got to remember with Mourinho is that everything he does is performance, particularly in public. It's all performance, and it's all to do with projecting a certain sort of image. And I think he knows he's sufficiently stung by what's happened, because it's been a pretty bad decade for him. Even though he's won a fair bit in his last, even though he won the Spanish title with Real Madrid and the English league back when he returned to Chelsea, he hasn't really been on. I don't think. He hasn't really unequivocally succeeded in a job since he left Inter 9 years ago.
Yeah,
almost 10 years ago.
He's riding on old successes a little bit.
I think he knows that he needs a slightly different image, a slightly different approach. He can't be as confrontational as he used to be with players. The classic Mourinho technique is something that he calls confrontational leadership, and that basically means hammering the players in public and private, trying to spark a reaction out of them. And I think he knows that it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked, and he needs a different approach. And that's why I think his approach now at Tottenham will be very much like trying to massage the egos of the players, tell them they're great, tell them he can help them to win if they come with him. Not dissimilar to his approach when he first arrived at Chelsea in 2004. Right. Like this morning I was reading Didier Drogba and Frank Lampard's autobiographies for a piece I'm working on about this. And it's all about Mourinho telling the players that they were brilliant. And that seems to be the same approach he's had since showing up at Tottenham recently.
Cool dad.
Yeah, and I do think with that as well, like the Chelsea were this kind of like upstart, weren't they, at that time? And Tottenham are a lot more popular, broadly speaking, with neutrals, but there's a similarity there in that, they haven't won anything and they're a little bit on the outside.
They're underdogs.
Yeah, they're underdogs, right? They're not that elite. Whereas I think, it's hard to... United, that's not what they're about. They're the best and they shouldn't be sort of yielding to anyone. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think so far it's one of these things. We all know he's playing up to it, and this whole "I'm humble," which, as Jack said yesterday, once you can't describe yourself in those terms, it kind of negates it.
I guess you could say that you've been humbled.
Yeah,
that might be a more sort of reasonable position to take,
possibly. But I'm not sure. At the press conference today before the United game, a lot of the questions were about how do you look back on that, and he didn't really want to be drawn too much onto it. But I don't think I think he's proud of what he achieved at United as well. I don't think he views it as a failure particularly.
It's hard to look back on. I mean, as you say, maybe a little bit more time and distance. You can look back on his second stint at Chelsea in a slightly different way than you could when he first joined United, because it was so recent. I mean, it was so toxic at the end of his reign at Manchester United that it is very difficult to look back at it and understand, or at least immediately see why he would be proud. Of course, there were achievements there at the time. I mean, they won the Europa League, for example. But generally speaking, I mean, given what was the expectations were, and given what presumably Mourinho's own expectations of himself would be, it was a failure, right?
That's true. And I've always... I've not been a big fan of Mourinho's work in the last few years. However, there is a counterpoint to that, which says the further away we get from Mourinho being sacked by United, the more right he looks in retrospect, in the sense that like the players are rubbish.
Yeah.
The players are rubbish.
That's the case with every United coach.
The players are rubbish. There's bad attitudes in the squad. Ed Woodward is not doing a good job of providing the club with direction. Manchester City are very hard to compete with, as Mourinho said. And so all these things, which at the time sounded like excuses from Mourinho, in fact have been, like, none of them have really been disproven under Solskjaer, barring that kind of 1 month at the start when they were really, really good. That's because when that was happening, I was thinking, wow, Mourinho really was the problem here. These guys are great. Pogba, Martial, Rashford, these guys are great players. Jose was inhibiting them, and now they're going to be good again. Since February, since Solskjaer got the job permanently, United have been terrible, and Mourinho looks like increasingly right with every bad Manchester United result that happens. So it's not as simple as people like me thought it was at the time. Basically,
I wonder as well with that. I mean, if you think he's taking over Tottenham now, who are probably not in a massively dissimilar position from the United team who took over, where they are. They're one of the big six clubs, that they're in that kind of upper echelon. And if over the next 2 seasons at Spurs he won the League Cup, won the Europa League and finished second in the league, they take that, wouldn't they?
Definitely,
That would be a pretty amazing.
that would be great.
2 trophies and a second place finish would be a pretty amazing couple of years. And because that was at Manchester United, who we look at as Manchester United, they should be winning the league. They should win the Champions League.
That's true. So it's an interesting idea, actually, that the perceptions might count in his favour there, and also, the difference being that, as you say, we look back on the Pochettino era with awe in some sense, and celebrate it for what a fantastic achievement it was, but they didn't really win anything. So I mean, there's as you said, the perceptions really are quite different there.
I do think that, like, while I don't really back Mourinho I don't think Mourinho is going to do what Pochettino did. I don't think he'll still be there in 5.5 years' time and produce like a series of consistently high Premier League finishes. I do think that he gives them the best possible chance of winning a trophy as in not this season, but probably next season. Like Mourinho's teams always peak after about 18 months. So that means by the end of next season, I think they will be really, really good. And I do back them to win something next year. And also I think he will succeed in the sense of keeping Tottenham very much as a sort of high-profile team who are occupying the attention of world football, which has really been a big part of what Daniel Levy's been trying to do. You can see it with the new stadium, the Amazon documentary. If Daniel Levy were to want to sell Tottenham, if ENIC were to want to sell Tottenham or a stake in Tottenham, then obviously having Jose Mourinho, the best known manager of all time, as your manager is incredibly helpful in helping you to do that. If you want to get, whether it's Americans or Chinese or Middle Eastern investors into the club. So I think he makes perfect sense in that logic. And even just thinking about the last few days, you think, what would it be like if Eddie Howe had taken over? Like, Eddie Howe's a great coach who's done really well at Bournemouth and everything, but the whole conversation and feel around Tottenham would be totally different from the one it is at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. They are the biggest show in town, it feels like, at the moment. The club everyone's talking about. I think as well with Mourinho, one thing, it's interesting there, Jack, you talk about, how he connected with those players when he was at Chelsea. And it's interesting now to think that this is a whole like new generation of players, and he does need to slightly prove that he can connect with a different generation who are motivated in very different ways. I mean, we've seen this so often that managers kind of hark back to a day where players were tougher and, all of this sort of thing. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's better. I don't think there is an objective better. It's just different and you have to adapt. And so I think it's a really big challenge, one that at the moment looks like it's going well, but we're only a few games in. That can Mourinho connect with this group of players who were born, it's just complete
in the 90s.
In the 90s, they're not children of the 80s.
You're saying can he be down with
the
kids?
He needs to be down with the kids, with the Snapchats.
What are the kids doing? I really don't know.
TikTok.
Is that a thing?
TikTok. Yeah, but no, that's a great point. Mourinho has like a long-standing problem with like millennials or even like Gen Z players, as in players younger than millennials. They're the only player I can think of who Mourinho's got anything out of who was born after 1985 is like Scott McTominay.
Right.
McTominay aside, like he's not really.
Jesse Lingard a little bit early on.
It's only a little bit, and if you look at like the clash that he had with Pogba,
I was going to say
Pogba's a great example because Pogba's like the iconic millennial player, really. and Jose didn't really get through to him at all. Not for want of trying, but he never really got anything out of Pogba in their time together at Manchester United. And while this Tottenham squad, I look at the Tottenham squad, I think it does have quite a lot of players who are, they have the kind of like old-fashioned character and ethos of the kind of classic Mourinho players, whether it's, Drogba, Schneider, Zanetti, Cambiasso, those kind of guys. So I'm thinking like Kane, Alderweireld, probably Vertonghen, Lucas, Son. Those guys I think will be really, really good. That's why Deli Alli is so fascinating, because Deli Alli is he's not really a player of that ilk. He is a more, I don't know, is Deli Alli millennial or Gen Z? He's probably Gen Z, because I think he's
when
born
does
about...
Gen Z start?
Gen Z is like
23, isn't he?
Gen Z is like people born in the sort of late 90s, 2000s. Deli Alli was born in 1994?
Should we be saying Gen Z?
I don't know. Well, I kind of read this off Americans on Twitter. That's why I say Gen Z.
Okay, so maybe
Gen Z sounds better.
I'm going to say Gen Z. Gen Z.
You should get the listeners to tweet in. Is Deli Alli millennial or Gen Z?
Yeah, okay, and that will be conclusive answers. Although I'm sure there'll be numerous for both. That's an interesting idea. I'd not really thought about him connecting with younger players before, because I suppose if you think about him at Porto, really not that old at all. He's more of a kind of older brother figure to many of the senior players. By the time he arrives at Manchester United, he's a jaded dad.
Yeah, well, also then he was like anti-establishment, wasn't he?
Right.
He was this kind of outsider, this kind of challenger brand, and then that goes on. So then it becomes that then he is like Mr. Establishment.
Right.
It feels like.
Yeah.
But I think he's much better as a kind of underdog than as an establishment figure. Like I've just finished reading Diego Torres' book about Mourinho's time at Real Madrid, the special one, which is amazing. It's the best football book I've ever read.
Really?
I 1,000,000% recommend you reading it.
Christmas presents.
Yeah. And a lot of the story of that is about how Mourinho's management style is all based on like challenging the system and being kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Cheeky, like mischievous. And Real Madrid is an incredibly establishment club. And he just doesn't really fit in there with the ethos of...
He's too punk.
Yeah, he is too punk.
But he took an OBE.
He doesn't fit in with the ethos of Florentino Perez and the Casillas and all these guys who want a much more like traditional, corporate, respectful, gentlemanly approach.
He's looking for siege mentality.
Yeah,
as a form of solidarity.
You look at him, he'd be better fit at Atletico.
Right.
In a way.
Totally.
Well, he makes sense to Spurs then, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why... That's one of the reasons why I'm kind of bullish about how well he'll do at Spurs, is even though on the surface it looks weird seeing a team, seeing Spurs, who as we know haven't won anything for a while, managed by Mourinho, who used to be one of the best managers in the world, and clearly like they've both had to make a big step towards each other for this to happen. Like Jose's had to take a job with a team which isn't an elite team, which he's never done before, or not for like 18 years, and Spurs have kind of taken a manager who exists in a kind of plane above them. But because he's taking such a step down, suddenly I think he can I just have this confidence that he can rediscover a bit of that Porto, Chelsea 2004 underdog spirit. And if he can do that...
Inter Milan, my Italian football history is not good. What was the expectations for Inter Milan when he took the job there? Were they similarly underdogs? Certainly they would have been in the Champions League.
They hadn't won a Champions League since the mid-60s, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in that respect, they certainly weren't... They weren't one of the European superpowers.
Yeah.
And he was able to, to do that with them.
Right.
And that was Massimo Moratti's like massive obsession, was winning their first Champions League since the glory days. And he didn't think, like they tried and spent so much money over the years, they'd never been able to do it. And then Mourinho showed up in 2008, and then in his second season, he won the treble with that amazing team, which I think is still like the greatest Mourinho team, just in terms of being a total execution of his principles.
Remind me of some of the names.
And Materazzi.
Schneider, Eto'o, Diego Milito up front, Goran Pandev, Thiago Motta, Cambiasso, Samuel, Kivu, Zanetti.
Right.
But to me, Materazzi is the one that sticks out as like just an arsehole, but like a really, but just so effective at what he did. They had this amazing defence.
Who's Mourinho's arsehole at Spurs?
Well, I mean,
we thought like Eric Dyer's been reintroduced into the team. He's not like a huge arsehole though, is he?
No, he's got a bit of an edge to it. I mean, Deli Alli, I like him. I think he's best when he is a bit naughty.
He's cheeky.
You know, and he's got that in his locker. Like someone like Lamella, I mean, he is like he is someone who once he gets back, he's not fit at the moment. You know, I think Mourinho would love him because he's good. He's very good at attacking players. He's got a bit of devil in him as well.
It's not huge wages, isn't he, Lamella? I heard that he was one of the
he's one of the best paid players at the club.
Yeah.
He got a big new deal on
surprises me.
100 plus grand a week. The thing is, they bought him for a lot of money. They bought him for like 30 million back in 2013.
Was he one of the people who came out after Bale?
Yes, and they've had opportunities. Like there've been times in the past where he's nearly gone to Juve, Porto, Inter, Milan, Marseille, and it's never quite happened. But because he came on a lot of money, Spurs have been determined to keep his value high by giving him new contracts. And his last new contract was quite a big one. I've always been a big Lamella fan. But the Deli Alli thing is a really interesting example because he's. I remember once when Mourinho was still at Chelsea second time around, he was talking to us in a press conference about how he sees like the ideal number 10. Yeah. And he was talking about Oscar, who at that time had a kind of a role quite similar to Deli Alli's role now. So he would like arrive late in the box, score quite a lot of goals. And Mourinho was saying, I think the words he described were like, I want a number 10 to be a 9.5 when we have the ball, as in that is someone in the box scoring goals, and then an 8.5 when we don't have the ball.
Right.
And that's basically how Deli Alli was playing. He compared it to Schneider at Inter and Deco at Porto. So it'd be interesting to see if Deli Alli continues this great run he's on at the moment, whether he can become that kind of Schneider-y type player.
Would you like to protect your online privacy? I know I would, because in the internet age, it's easy to feel like you have all the freedom in the world, but you don't. The truth is that we've never been more monitored by governments, ISPs and ad companies. In fact, all UK internet service providers like BT or Sky have to keep records of your online activity for 12 months. This includes all the websites you visit, apps you use and your private conversations. It doesn't matter if you're suspected of a crime or not, the government can look into you without a warrant. And that's why you can protect your online privacy with ExpressVPN. Whether you're at home or on public Wi-Fi, ISPs are recording your internet activity. If you don't want them or the police snooping on your data, you have to use a VPN. And it's not just for people in the UK. In the US, ISPs can even sell your data to advertising companies. ExpressVPN is very easy to use. Just download the app onto your computer or your phone and click connect, and voila, you are protected. You use the internet just like you normally would, but with ExpressVPN, your data is encrypted and your IP address is masked. So, protect your online activity today like we did and find out how you can get 3 months free at expressvpn.com/Tifo. That's expressvpn.com/Tifo for 3 months free with a 1-year package. Visit expressvpn.com/Tifo to learn more. Well, we've talked about Deli Alli on the YouTube channel before as a bit of a roundoiter in the sense that he isn't, necessarily.
That's such a Tifo word.
Yeah. Thank you. But he in the sense that he, he's. I suppose the only thing is he's quite tall. That's the only thing which really marks him out. Beyond that, but that he's not. He's not overly skillful. For example, I mean, he knows how to kick a football, sure, but he's not. He's not Ronaldinho, for example. He's not super fast. He does score a lot of goals, but then many of them tend to be either, nice tap-ins or kind of bog standard right place, right time. And it's not totally obvious immediately to see why he's such a good player, but everyone knows that he is.
That's why he has that kind of like the two players who I think he reminds me of, and not actually those sort of number 10s I listed a minute ago, but Antoine Griezmann and Thomas Muller,
right,
as in players whose number one skill is that like sense of anticipation in the box, knowing where the ball's going to break, having that kind of that's just
the
that
literal
kind of
space investigator.
Yeah, I think of someone like Freddie Ljungberg as well used to be,
right.
and the kind of player who, when not scoring, you're kind of thinking, what's this guy doing? He's not as conspicuous as some of those others. I mean, Ali, he does have skills too. He, lots of nice flicks and that sort of thing. But yeah, similar to those kind of players, he you can lose him a little bit. And so I think that was slightly the problem in the latter Pochettino days, because he wasn't playing so advanced. And so he wasn't really contributing as many goals and assists as we've become accustomed to.
That's a systematic? The reason he wasn't playing so advanced is because of the type of system that Pochettino was seeking to play?
Yeah, partly that. And also I think they were a slight victim of their own success because Son had done so well centrally last season, and in particular in the Champions League run in Kane's absence. It then felt harsh almost to just like shunt him back to the wing, but that crowded Ali out. And yes, they did change their system, and it just didn't quite work as effectively.
Okay, well, tell you what, let's talk about, broadly speaking, the 3 games that we have so far. It's important to mention that we were recording this on Tuesday morning. It will be released Wednesday morning, the day of the Manchester United game. So we're going to avoid previews, and obviously there's, I suppose you could say, a bigger challenge to come. Spurs have played West Ham, Olympiacos and Bournemouth so far. And we've seen a few different approaches already. Certainly departures from Pochettino. The first thing that I think a lot of people were talking about is the staggered fullbacks, Serge Aurier being pushed significantly higher up on the right, and in fact even in the most recent game against West Ham, Jan Vertonghen appearing to play, and I suppose it ended up being a bit of a back 3 really, didn't it? The other was bringing back in Eric Dyer into the midfield double pivot and having 2 players there, and also Deli Alli in the kind of 10 role. Have I missed anything, and which of those has been the most important or the most interesting to either of you to examine?
Well, for me, I think broadly what tends to happen when you've been somewhere a long time, as Pochettino was, you feel, if you're not changing personnel, you feel like you do have to tweak the system a little bit. So I feel he moved away from maybe what had been most successful because he felt he had to shake things up, and maybe other players like Son or someone played their way into form. What I think Mourinho essentially has done has been able to revert to when they were at their most successful, and that's been really effective in just giving them a kind of jolt that they needed. Yes, the Aurier sort of advanced fullback is probably the biggest difference and the most interesting thing tactically. But really it's saying, right, Ali, you are most effective as a number 10 playing off Kane, so let's put you back there. Son, we actually think you're most effective out wide on the left, cutting in. And we're going to play with those 2 hold midfielders shielding the back 4. It's kind of a back to basics approach. And those players, because they've done it for so many years, look very comfortable doing it. It just feels like they've sort of slotted, that move back home almost, is my reading of it.
What do you think, Jack?
I think it's been really interesting to see. I think I wouldn't have expected him to like Aurier as much as he did, because Aurier is obviously a player who makes a lot of mistakes, and the one thing Mourinho is all about is stopping mistakes. And yet he's realised that there's not, there have been times recently where there's not really much pace or width in the team, and the only way he can get that is by making the most of Aurier's very obvious talents in that role. And it's been quite clever, because it's not just like a conventional 4-2-3-1. By doing this kind of strange lopsided 3-2-5 thing when they have the ball, he's managed to make sure they have width on both sides, pace, attacking men in the box, a solid base in front of the back 3. It's been, I'm sure he was working away on it long before Pochettino actually got the bullet, but it's kind of fun to watch, and also it gives them a kind of a sort of fresh way of approaching games. The other thing they've got is being direct. Like Pochettino is very much about building out from the back. Everything goes from Lloris to Vertonghen into the midfield, through the thirds, up through the pitch, whereas Mourinho is very happy for Gazzaniga, Alderweireld, Vertonghen, Sanchez, whoever, just to hit it long. And they've had great success in this. Like Toby
scored 2 on the weekend,
2 long balls from Toby on the weekend against Bournemouth that led to goals.
That were so good. We would describe them here as long passes. Because the idea of long ball, it's a very Sam Allardyce related thing, lobbing up there and hoping that someone... both of those balls, I must say that for the first goal, Son did an incredible job to cushion there.
Yeah.
Same with Deli Alli for the second one, but both balls, you also have to criticise Bournemouth a little bit. They were right central down the middle. They
Mourinho
shouldn't
said
be that hard to defend.
that was something they had identified as a weakness and tried to exploit.
Okay.
But yes, absolutely. They were amazing passes.
3 games deep, I suppose aspects of play like that, like the kind of long ball, long pass thing, it's going to be difficult for us to say at this moment whether they are things that we will see more regularly, or whether they are, as you say, things that are identified as weaknesses against opposition that are coming up. The one thing I suppose that we should touch on is that Olympiacos, West Ham, Bournemouth, no disrespect, none of them, you would expect Spurs to win those games, let's say. You would also expect Spurs to beat Manchester United, but you're also about to play Bayern Munich in a few weeks' time. Do you think that the perception, it is possible that the perception around Mourinho at Tottenham will dampen slightly when we presume he will take a more defensive approach to bigger games, as we've seen him do throughout his career? Will that take the sheen off it a little bit? I mean, results dependent, obviously.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that's it. We were talking about this yesterday, and my piece from the weekend was on this, that it, you know, in all respects, so Mourinho being this like humble, nice bloke in the world, and him playing in a slightly more offensive way, that's all going to be really tested as early as tomorrow night, or tonight as you watch this, at Old Trafford, because both the humility thing will come under pressure because he's got a point to prove, and also he has tended to play more defensively in the big games. You know, he's not this super defensive coach all the time, but generally in the biggest matches he has erred on the side of caution. So I think we will see that tomorrow. But yeah, look, if they go and win 1-0 and are super cautious, great. I don't think anyone's going to mind that. It's if they go and it's really flat and, you know, they kind of invite pressure against the team who are there for the taking, then that's when you may see some frustration.
Presumably as well, the story of this evening will be Mourinho's return to Manchester United, right? Rather than necessarily how Spurs are going to play, whether they're going to be more defensive, you know, any of those derisory parking the bus comments will presumably feature much lower down the comment sections beneath the highlights of these videos. Do you think that will take the pressure off the players a little bit?
Yeah, I think it helps the Spurs players for this to be all about Mourinho. Mourinho, that is another thing he's very good at, is making things about him to take the attention away from his players. That's a big feature of the Drogba and Lampard books about the kind of peak Chelsea years, 2004 to 2007. And it certainly will help the Spurs players going into the next game. Like, there's barely been any... The Spurs players got a bit of a hammering in public over the dying days of Pochettino, because there was so much sympathy and credit stored up for Pochettino. But I do think the Spurs players had a pretty easy ride of it in the media in the last few weeks, because all the attention's been on the manager instead, and I think that will probably continue. It's
amazing, isn't it, how when things are going well, Mourinho's ability to make it all about himself is seen, and I think fairly so, seen not only as a positive, a distraction from the players, an ability to take pressure off the players, but also a kind of pious sacrifice of himself. When things aren't going so well, suddenly it's seen as an arrogance and a deflection. And as you say before, you know, watching towards the end of the Man United period, a lot of excuses and a lot of toxicity and stuff like that for essentially what is the same technique, right? It's just an interesting thing.
And that, I think that's a really interesting theme. It's one I looked at earlier this season, but the way that you reframe a manager's methods according to their results. And so like Pochettino, when things were going well, it was this like meticulous attention to detail, obsessive, but in an amazing way. You know, that's how he gets his results. And then and he'd always video training sessions, and then it became this sort of like, he's videoing training sessions as this weird like Big Brother overlord, you know, and it's like
he's got the evidence when he loses his job that it wasn't his fault.
Yeah, but it is just like we do that all the time. We reframe, right. But yes. So at the moment, it seems like Mourinho, you know, those methods are working and are good and are right. But yeah, it won't take long for us to be back on the this doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you about January, but before we do that, would you care to tell our listeners about your new podcast?
So we have a podcast called The View from the Lane, which is recorded every Monday and released first thing every Tuesday morning, featuring me, Charlie, and another person. So in this case, it was James Moore, who's a member of the Athletic team and also a Tottenham fan. We just talk about Spurs' most recent games, our recent reporting on Spurs, press conferences, what Mourinho's like, the stories around the club, that sort of thing. It's not very long. It's only about 35 minutes, so you can listen to it on your way to work or where and whenever you listen to your podcasts.
Right.
And it's free.
freely
It's
available,
free. It's
right?
free. Yeah.
That's the
You
thing
don't
to
even
mention.
have to have an athletic subscription, although of course you should have one.
You should have one. And you can get one by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo and getting 50% off an annual subscription and a 30-day free trial to read some of Jack and Charlie's things, realise it's rubbish and then not subscribe. I think that's no, not that at all. Do please subscribe. January's upcoming. It's the transfer window. It was very exciting, isn't it? Everyone's obviously always really, really excited about it. Mourinho is known as a manager who likes to spend money and buy new players. Is there money available for a start?
I think there will be. I think Mourinho wouldn't have taken the job if he were not able to spend money. I know that in his unveiling press conference, he said that he didn't need to spend because this squad was a present. I think in reality, they do. He knows they need more players. They will be looking in the market. In terms of names they're linked with, the one that keeps coming up is Bruno Fernandes of Sporting Lisbon, who, of course, Pochettino tried to sign in the summer, but the Spurs couldn't quite get the money together. I think he's going to be expensive. His price is what it was in the summer, which is 70 million euros.
Yeah.
But he's like a very good number 10. And with Eriksen going either in January or at the end of the season, and with question marks still over Giovanni Lo Celso, Fernandes would be an obvious pick. I think also defender Ruben Dias at Benfica is a name that I heard recently. I don't know much about him.
You got the Portuguese connection though.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see. It's also like a classic Mourinho move is when he goes into a new job to try and sign a player or two who he's worked with before, or who you can expect a bit of loyalty from. Which
leads us on to then the idea he might go for a striker as well in a kind of Llorente, Kane understudy mould. Mm-hmm. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because you've got these two opposing philosophies, maybe not the right word, but Mourinho, as you say, is used to spending money and bringing players in. Obviously, Levy will only do deals that he thinks are really worth doing, and January is a very hard time to find value, and he's been very reluctant to do that previously. So, kind of have to see where those two meet in the middle.
I kind of feel like I don't have any strong information for this. It's just an instinctive sense. When you appoint Mourinho, you kind of have to adapt how you work a bit to fit him. You can't. It just doesn't make sense to appoint Mourinho and then treat him like he's a manager. He's like an up and coming manager like Pochettino, who's done well but never really won anything.
Which is kind of what happened at United, where they
still
refused him money or turned
but
down.
they still
spent a lot.
They still bought Lukaku. They still bought Pogba. Even when he went back to Chelsea in 2013, he didn't have total control, but they still bought players and they were active in the market, even if it was more Emanalo. I think that, to some extent, Levy cannot run Tottenham in the same way now as he did in the past, because it's different. Working with Pochettino, working with Pochettino is different from working with the most famous manager of all time. And I just feel like it wouldn't make sense to spend all the money on getting Mourinho in and his assistants and everything, and then to say, oh, but you want to defend, there's no more money. The money stops here.
Presumably he will know that, right?
Yeah, but this is what I think is so interesting about this sort of power dynamic, because it's who is the kind of senior partner in all of this, in the sense that, as you say, it would have, a few years ago, it would have been Mourinho's up here, Tottenham's somewhere down there, and they have, they've gone on these different trajectories, almost to the point where a lot of Tottenham fans really didn't want Mourinho. Yeah. And, and Mourinho, his name had been tarnished a little bit. I mean, of course you'd expect he could get a job at a club like PSG or someone like that, but for a Premier League club, I don't know, his reputation has, the whole United thing. So it's kind of whether, who is doing more of the compromising, I guess, is what I'm saying. Is Mourinho, was he told by Daniel Levy, well, yes, you can have this job, but it's not going to be 200 million being spent every summer like you're used to? Or was it Mourinho saying, look, I'll come, but you better give me more money than you did Poch?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting dynamic. I remember after this happened, Gary Neville was talking about this on Monday Night Football, and he said he described Tottenham and Mourinho as a marriage of convenience, in the sense that both of them it's not a perfect long-term fit for either party. Both of them have had to compromise a bit on what they would ideally want for this particular arrangement, but it does make sense to both of them here and now. I do think that ultimately, it is still really jarring to see Mourinho there, and I still think that he is fundamentally much bigger than the club. Like, I thought that at his unveiling press conference, where there were more journalists there than there were for their press conference before the Champions League semi-final, the Champions League final last year. Like, this was obviously the Champions League final is probably the biggest match that Tottenham have ever played, but the appointment of Mourinho is the biggest story that has ever happened to Tottenham, and they've never been as famous as they are now. And I just had this overwhelming sense, and I haven't, like, nothing has shaken me out of this since. The overwhelming sense that Mourinho is simply much bigger than Spurs. Like, the only other thing I can compare it to is when back in 2016, when Guardiola showed up at Manchester City, as in a club which hadn't won an awful lot and then a superstar manager. But even then, City had won the Premier League in 2012 and 2014. Like, it's kind of, like, I've been trying and I cannot think of another precedent quite like this, where you have the superstar manager in a club which is still, like, aspirational rather than elite.
I'm also, the reason I think neither of us spoke immediately is because we were trying to think as well.
Would like an Ancelotti at Napoli or something like that? I mean, he's such, like, you know, footballing royalty, and they are more of a kind of upstarty challenger kind of club. Though. He is old.
He's kind of, you know,
he's royalty, but he's like kind of cuddly royalty.
He's
not like
cuddly.
He's not box office. He's like a dream father-in-law.
I mean, Mourinho, does that slightly speak as well to the fact that not many managers have had that kind of decline that, in perception anyway, that Mourinho's had in the last few years? You know, it tends to be once you get to that
from
level.
the top.
Yeah,
right?
If you think he was right at the very top, and then his name has been tarnished, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah. Well, if this, like, I can't actually think of a good example, because generally, like, someone like Ferguson or Wenger, they both quit after a long. I mean, Wenger hasn't retired as a manager yet, but they both stopped managing after a long spell in their kind of definitive job. I suppose maybe if you looked at someone, maybe one of these other older Italian managers, like a
Sacchi,
Lippi or Ancelotti, doing slightly different, or Capello perhaps, doing slightly different levels of job after they retired. But none of them, even at their best, like Lippi, Capello, Ancelotti, never had quite the same kind of, like, cachet as Jose. Jose is a very much like
cult
a 21st century invention, I think, really, whose like psychological power and media profile and fame couldn't really have existed in quite the same way, I think, in like the 1980s and 90s.
What about Brian Clough?
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Going to Brighton?
Yeah.
Maybe, but that's, and that works, but it's just a different
he
didn't have that same kind of, like, well, maybe he did have that same
relative.
Did you get Jonathan Wilson on? We're in the wrong. You got the wrong guest.
Right. Yeah. I often think that when Jonathan Wilson's not here, I've got the wrong guest. Yeah. Can we just have a very quick look at the squad then? We talked about names that Spurs are connected to, or, you know, at least in the sort of gossip news cycle, and maybe players that Mourinho might want to bring in. When the two of you look at the squad as it is and the team and where the deficiencies might be, are there any obvious areas in need of improvement?
I think the fullbacks is the thing that was such a great strength when you think to that team that we keep talking about, that 2016-17 team, when they had Rose and Walker.
Yeah.
Rose actually injured for a lot of that season, but, you know, that was their peak years, and those two were so important to that, and that's been a huge drop-off to what they have now on both sides, despite Aurier's recent improvement.
It's an expensive place to go and look.
It is, yeah.
So important these days. Okay, fine. Well, listen, guys, thanks so much for coming in. Have I missed anything that you wanted to talk about? We've been pretty broad, haven't we?
Yeah.
I think we've done a good job.
Yeah,
great. Okay, well, Jack, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure.
Charlie, thanks for coming in first time.
Pleasure.
Lovely to meet you.
Thanks very much, Anne.
And I hope that people can find The View from the Lane, and all the places that you would ordinarily find a podcast, and do subscribe to The Athletic. And thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.